thank you so much for joining. Purchasing advice is an awesome feature in Counterpoint, a great topic that a lot of people don't understand. So hopefully at the end of this, you'll understand it and be able to put it into practice. So I'm going to stop my video now and we'll just look at the slide presentation. And like Ryan said, just feel free to put any comments at the end and we'll answer questions. This is what we see a lot. Buyers are confused about what they should be ordering. You don't want to be out of stock. You don't want to be overstocked. It's a very confusing process sometimes, and purchasing advice can really help you get a handle on what you should be purchasing, primarily for your stock goods that you order over and over again. You don't want to be understocked. You don't want to be overstocked. You always want the optimal quantity on hand. Like I said, it's great for stock products that you order consistently. It's not really a good tool for things that are seasonal or that you only order, once or twice because you don't have the historical factors and there just isn't the need for purchase advice for that kind of product. It also helps you manage your inventory from a dollar standpoint. So rather than having a lot of merchandise sitting in your warehouse, eating up money and not turning, doing purchase advice allows you to get more turns on your purchases and turn your money over quicker and just make better use of those funds. So we have 3 different methods of purchasing advice. And you can find purchasing advice under purchasing, purchase request, purchase advice. 3 different methods. We have replenishment, we have maximum, and we have days of supply. So before we go into those different methods, I want to talk about the need for having your vendor item information filled out and as accurate as you can, because a lot of the vendor item information is used during the purchase advice. So your vendor item record, you can get to that either from a button down at the bottom of the item screen, or you can go into purchasing vendor items and find that here. First of all, I think it's important to note, and sometimes people don't know this, that you can have more than one vendor item for a particular item. So an example might be you sell gallons of milk and maybe you buy gallons of milk from 10 different vendors. Well, you don't need to have 10 different items in Counterpoint. You just need to have 10 different vendor items under your main item of gallon of milk. So you can have multiple unique vendor items with all of the purchasing information from each unique vendor under the item. So when we set up the vendor item, we have all these different fields here. So we have the purchase unit, and so that's how we have to purchase this item from this particular vendor. So in my example here, our purchasing unit is a dozen. So then the next is the conversion factor. How many of our stocking units or how many of our purchasing units equal how many stocking units? So we've got that conversion there. Then we have what is our minimum order quantity from the vendor? What is our unit cost for the purchase unit from the vendor? And then if we have to purchase this in specific multiples of that purchase unit, you can add the multiples there. And then the lead time. And the lead time comes into play if you're using min-max advice, which I'm going to talk about in a minute, and the need for that. And if you decide to use lead time, if you know your lead times, you can key those numbers in, or Counterpoint can auto-calculate lead times for you based on the time between when you enter a purchase order and when you actually receive that purchase order into stock. So a lot of these things are used in purchase advice, which is why it's important to understand this and have them filled out in the system. So again, we have the 3 methods of purchase advice. Replenishment, And so that's basically just ordering what was sold for a historical date range. Maximum, which is ordering up to the maximum quantity defined in the inventory record for the location. Days of supply is to order a quantity to last a certain number of days based on sales for a specific date range. All of these methods allow you to select the location to calculate the advice for, and you can either calculate it for just one individual location, a location group that you already have defined, or all the locations in your system. And then you'll notice as we go through this that there are slightly different selection parameters for each of the methods, just based on which one you pick. So the first one, and probably the most straightforward, is just replenishment. So here we're saying we just want to look at a sales range, and we want to purchase exactly what we sold during that sales range. So in my example here, I'm basically looking at the last month of sales. I want to look at sales from 1/21/24 through to 2024. And if I were to just run that calculation, it would just look at sales for that period and tell me I needed to order that quantity. I also have the ability to put on a history factor. So the history factor allows it to either increase or decrease by a percentage the number that we're going to order based on that sales calculation. So if I were to put a history factor of 1.25, it would calculate 25% more than what I sold during that range. Or I could put a history factor of 0.75, and it will calculate to order 25% less than what was sold during that sales date range. And then you'll notice there on the screen, there are several other fields that we're going to talk about in a minute that factor into the quantity that we order. Also, on each of these methods, we have the ability to further define by item fields or by inventory fields what we're ordering. So for example, we may just want to order for a particular category rather than looking at all categories of merchandise from a particular vendor. So on the item tab, you would have the ability to filter this purchase advice by category. So that's replenishment. The next is maximum. So the maximum method relies on you having min and max quantities defined in your inventory records. So on the inventory screen, which you can get to from a button at the bottom of your item screen, and also you can go to inventory and get it there. We have an inventory record for the item for each location that you have, and then each location that you were ordering for would need to have a min and max defined in order to use this method. If you are ordering grid items, you can set the min and max values for the grid cells on the model stock tab of the inventory record. So when we use the maximum method, it's going to start out by calculating how many you would need to order based on ordering up to the max in the inventory record that we talked about. If you don't have mins and maxes already defined in your system and you want to use this method, there is a min-max advice report that you can run, and it will generate and report for you or generate and apply min and max values to your items if they don't already exist. And there are a couple different methods when you run that report that it can calculate the min max for. And that is one area where that lead time can come into play, because you may need to factor in lead time in to determine how many you should be purchasing to cover that lead time. Then the third method is days of supply. So days of supply calculates the quantity that you need to cover your sales based on a sales date range as you define. So some kind of historical date range. Again, we can apply a history factor to that just like we could in replenishment. And then we tell it how many days of supply we want to order for based on this sales date range. So here we're saying we want to order 60 days of supply based on the sales for during the period of the last month. And then this method also looks at quantity on hand and actual sales to suggest quantities to order. So on this report also, there's a few other things that we can define. So when we run this report, we can select which vendor we want to run the report for. So we can tell it we want to look at just the primary vendor for our items. We can look at the lowest cost vendor for the items, and we can choose to look at a specific vendor for the purchase advice. So I can say, for example, I want to order all of the clothing items from any vendor. In that case, I would say a specific vendor, and then I would define the specific vendor. Or I can say, I want to run a purchase advice for clothing and just show me the primary vendor, where they would come from. Or I want to run a purchase advice for clothing, and I want you to tell me who the lowest cost vendor is if you have multiple vendors for a particular product. So that's that first field over here on the right. You're going to select which vendor you want to generate the advice for. And then how you want the units to be calculated for your purchase advice. So do you want it to be in the stocking unit? And the stocking unit is defined on the item tab. Generally, that's each. And then, or do you want it to calculate in the vendor unit? So if you have to order from the vendor in their purchasing unit, which we saw on that vendor item screen in the beginning, then it will tell you how many of the vendor purchase unit you need to purchase instead of the stocking unit. Also, if you're using different purchase units than stocking units, you need to set the purchase unit as an alternate unit and in the vendor, or excuse me, in the item record. So then we have some more options to select from here that will help to calculate how much you should be ordering. So for example, the replenishment one, we'll talk about that because that's the easiest one to talk about. So let's say, for example, we sold 100 during that sales period that we want to replenish to. Then we have some options here that we can adjust that 100 for. So if we want to adjust the 100 and take away from it any quantity that's on a current purchase request, so that's an unposted purchase order, or any that are on open purchase orders that we have not received yet. And then if we want to adjust it for the vendor minimum, and again, that was set in the vendor item record. We also can adjust down for our current quantity on hand. We can tell it we only want it to determine an order quantity for items that have fallen below minimum. We can tell it we only want to order up to maximum. So in that case, let's say we sold the 100, but the maximum quantity for the item is only 80. Well, then we would only want it to calculate up to the 80 if we had that maximum quantity box checked. And then down at the bottom, the vendor multiple. Do we want it to go ahead and round to whatever our vendor order multiple is on the advice report? So if we were to leave all those unchecked and we had sold the 100 it would just tell us to order 100. But maybe, like I said, maybe our maximum is 80, and so then it would drop it to 80. Maybe I have 10 on hand and I don't want to I want to factor that in. Well, that would drop my order quantity down to 70. Then if I had some on open purchase orders and purchase requests, it would factor those out as well. So then also when you're selecting the report options, at the top of the report, you've got several ways to run the report, and you can run it by different variations of the vendor item, the vendor number, the location, and the item number. So that's going to show how that purchase advice report is actually going to display. Then there are some options here for grids. So if you sell grid items, and we're doing the advice for gridded items, do you want to see your grid cell information in a grid view, or do you want to see it in a list view? And then do you want to see your cell quantity information, just the suggested quantity? Do you also want to see sold, on hand, and suggested for each grid cell? And then the min and max and suggested for each grid cell, but that's only available if you choose the maximum method of purchase advice. So that's those few fields up here. And then down here at the bottom, for all items, these 3 fields down at the bottom are for all items. And these up here, sorry, these show all quantities. So show all quantities is going to show us the quantities from several different inventory fields and vendor item fields. And I'm going to show you that in a screenshot at the end. And then also, if we have the ability to show a listing of vendor items in lowest cost order. So in that case, if we have multiple vendor items for a product, it's going to show us all of those vendor items on the advice, and then it's going to show the cost associated with it. So you can select which vendor you want to purchase from that has the lowest price. And then this print quantity sold down here, this is only available if you're using the max method. So once we have everything filled out, and so here's everything together of all those things we just talked about. Once you have all of your selection criteria, we have the option to email it. So you can email this report to yourself if you have that set up in your system. You can preview it, look at it on screen, and you can print it out to paper. So that lets you look at everything, see how it looks. A lot of times it's helpful to go back and, well, especially while you're learning this, enter in some of these different options and look at the different information that comes out on the report and how it affects the quantity that you're ordering. So looking at that report for a while, and then you have the option to generate purchase requests from this purchase advice. So this will create purchase requests based on all of these criteria. And so if you have multiple vendors that are being evaluated in this, it will create the purchase requests for all the different vendors. If you've selected just one vendor, it will just do it for that one vendor. And it creates the purchase requests for you, which is really nice because then you don't have to take this purchase advice report and key everything in. It'll automatically turn it into a purchase request. The great thing about that is that a purchase request can be edited before you post it into a purchase order. So you have the ability then to go in and look at that purchase request and make any modifications to it. So a lot of times it will generate things and you look at it and you think for some reason you want to add to the quantity or you want to remove an item, you know, lots of different ways to modify that. And so you can do that while it's a purchase request, and then you can go ahead and post that into a purchase order. So the ability to generate those and not have to key, and for this to figure out for you everything that you should be ordering is a really, really huge time saver. And this will allow you to order more frequently. So the ability to have the system help you do this means you don't have to pore over reports and walk the sales floor and all of those ways that, that we do to figure out what we should be ordering. This is a great, at minimum, starting point for those order quantities. So here are a couple of screenshots of the report. So this is just the basic report with the basic amount of information on it. So it's going to give you some costing information here. It's going to tell us here I should be ordering this item. The first one is ADM SCD. It's going to give us our costing information of what's already on PO, your min and max information, what you sold. This one I ran as a replenishment. So this is telling me my quantity needed was 25. And then my adjusted quantity in this case is also 25. So the adjusted quantity is where it's made the adjustment to account for the vendor purchase unit and all of those different things that you put in. So you can see that for each item here. And so since this is all one vendor and all one location, if I were to just go ahead and generate my purchase request for this, I would have 3 lines on my purchase request, 3 lines for the 3 items shown here with these adjusted quantities as my order quantity. And again, these have all been, depending on how you made your selections, these have all been rounded to whatever the vendor purchase unit is and the multiple and all of those different factors. Here's a different way to run the report, and this is using a couple of the check boxes that I talked about, the show all quantities checkbox and the vendors in list cost order. So here in the show all quantities, it's giving you even more information to look at. So here it's showing you how many you have on customer, back order, special order, and layaway. So you may want to look at those things and calculate that into your order quantity. And then your min max and your quantity on hand, committed, available, got extra information here, how many you sold. And then again, you've got your adjusted quantity versus your quantity needed. Then here we've got the vendors in list cost order example. So down here at the very bottom, this particular item I can get from 2 different vendors. And so in this case, both of them have the same cost, but if they had different costs, you would be able to look at this and see which one was the lowest cost vendor. And so that is purchase advice. Do we have any questions or any reviewing of anything desired?
Thanks, Karen. A lot of great information there. We do have one question that came through. Using the milk example, how do you set up multiple vendors for the same item?
Let me go back to that slide here. Okay, so if you are in the main item screen, if you go to inventory items and select your item, if you go to vendor item down at the bottom, it will bring up the main vendor item that goes along with the product. So you would see this if this was the primary one. You've got this green plus here. I hope you can see my mouse pointer. There's a green plus at the top. And if you click that, it will open up the screen to give you a brand new vendor item record associated with that item. So here you can see, this tells us what Counterpoint item number it's associated with. Whoops. What Counterpoint item number it's associated with. So then you would just put in your new item, your new vendor number, and then all of that purchasing information that goes with that vendor.
Thanks everyone for joining us. And